For decades, science fiction has invited audiences to imagine futures shaped by technology, ambition, and the unknown. But what most viewers never realize is that many of the genre's most iconic films once carried ideas far darker than what made it to the screen. Drafts buried in studio archives, early cuts shown only to closed-door executives, and production notes scattered across forgotten development rooms reveal a truth filmmakers rarely admit openly. Some of the most unsettling sci-fi concepts ever written were intentionally hidden from audiences. Long before these films premiered, directors and writers explored themes rooted not in fantasy, but in the unnerving overlap between speculative science and real-world experimentation. Scripts included biomodification trials that hit too close to rumored military projects, AI behavior modeled after controversial psychological studies, and genetic prototypes inspired by research no studio wanted to be associated with. When these ideas proved too abrasive, too disturbing, too realistic, or simply too ahead of their time, Hollywood quietly removed them, leaving behind versions of films that felt safer, more polished, and far less revealing. Yet traces remained. A line of dialogue oddly out of place. A plot shift that feels suspiciously abrupt. A character whose purpose seems rewritten halfway through. These cinematic fingerprints hint at something larger, stories that once pushed the boundaries of moral science, but were softened before the public ever had a chance to question them. Tonight, we're unlocking those sealed doors. This episode dives into 15 sci-fi films whose original visions were darker, sharper, and far more unsettling than what audiences ultimately saw. Some changes were driven by censorship, others by studio fear, and a few because the ideas came uncomfortably close to classified research taking place quietly behind government walls. These are the hidden experiments, concealed drafts, and shadow concepts buried beneath the films we thought we knew. 1. Annihilation, 2018. Annihilation already unsettles viewers with its surreal biology, but the earliest drafts and production notes reveal a version far more psychologically invasive. The Shimmer was originally conceived not as an alien ecological anomaly, but as an adaptive experimentation field designed to study human cognition through environmental manipulation. Its distortions weren't random, they were calibrated. Early treatments described the Shimmer as a semi-sentient system that mirrored real-world research into neurofeedback environments. Instead of merely refracting DNA, it was meant to generate controlled behavioral stimuli by reshaping surroundings based on the emotional states of those who entered. Scenes cut from the final film showed the landscape subtly adjusting to stress responses, colors shifting with pulse rates, plant structures reorganizing around subjects like evolving test chambers. Lena's personal journey was also once overtly tied to experimentation. Early drafts framed her as part of a covert military psychology program selected due to her high adaptability score. Researchers intended to track how individuals with trauma histories responded to environments that destabilized identity. In these versions, the Shimmer didn't merely transform biology. It probed emotional vulnerabilities, testing whether subjects could maintain coherence under sustained cognitive pressure. The team's encounters were originally more structured. Draft logs described stages of psychological breakdown, disorientation, mirroring, dissociation, and replication. These phases resembled controlled lab trials far more than organic phenomena. One removed monologue from Ventress explicitly stated that the Shimmer behaved like an experiment, observing its observers. Even the final confrontation between Lena and her double was earlier portrayed as a direct cognitive trial. Storyboards depicted the doppelganger mimicking not her movements but her emotional hesitations, suggesting it was learning to replicate her decision-making process in real time. Ultimately, the film's theatrical cut preserved its poetic ambiguity. But the hidden version was a chilling commentary on experimentation without consent, where the environment itself became both the apparatus and the researcher quietly rewriting the minds of those who stepped inside. 12 Monkeys, 1995. 12 Monkeys is often remembered for its twisting narrative of time travel and apocalyptic dread, but its earliest drafts delved much deeper into the psychological experimentation framework that shaped James Cole's journey. Before the film's structure became more metaphorical, the time travel program was explicitly described as a government-run behavioral research operation involving repeated cognitive trauma cycles. Early drafts portrayed Cole not as a volunteer but as a long-term test subject selected for his psychological fragility. The program's true purpose was not simply to gather historical data, but to study how the human mind responded to extreme temporal dislocation. Draft documents referenced temporal stress disorder, a condition where subjects experienced memory erosion hallucinations and identity destabilization symptoms strikingly similar to those reported in classified sensory disruption studies. In one removed subplot, Cole's visions were not time travel side effects, but intentionally implanted cognitive echoes designed to assess his susceptibility to false memory injection. Scientists tracked his reactions to conflicting timelines, effectively testing how much psychological distortion a subject could endure before losing coherence. Studio concerns about the film appearing too reminiscent of real-world behavior modification experiments led to the removal of these elements. The mental institution sequences were also once more explicit. Instead of suggesting that the future authorities manipulated Cole's sense of reality, early drafts directly stated it. Researchers observed how he interacted with fabricated environments meant to assess compliance under stress. These ideas blurred the line between time travel and psychological conditioning, a blend viewed as too complex and disturbing for a mainstream audience. Even the ending was once darker. Instead of a cyclical tragedy, the finale implied that Cole had been part of numerous temporal experiments, each repeating with slight variations, his memories overwritten each time to preserve the integrity of the study. While the final film remains a masterpiece of sci-fi surrealism, its hidden version reveals a far bleaker truth. Cole wasn't just traveling through time, he was being systematically broken by a program that viewed his mind as raw experimental material. 3 Ex Machina, 2014. Before Ex Machina became a sleek philosophical thriller, its earliest drafts painted a far darker picture of the facility where Ava was built, a location designed not as a research lab, but as a long-term behavioral experimentation chamber. Nathan's role in these early versions was not that of a visionary tech mogul, but of an unregulated scientist conducting ongoing cognitive trials on artificial minds, each iteration more unsettling than the last. Initial drafts described entire floors dedicated to failed prototypes, each representing a different experiment in emotional conditioning. Some units were trained to mimic attachment, others were isolated to observe whether synthetic minds would develop coping mechanisms similar to human trauma responses. Storyboards featured sterile chambers filled with disassembled bodies, their neural cores still active, quietly running incomplete emotional simulations. Nathan's surveillance system, already invasive in the final film, was originally portrayed as part of a closed-circuit cognition study. Early treatments emphasized that every interaction, every reaction from Ava and previous units was fed into an evolving algorithm designed to assess whether artificial consciousness could be systematically manipulated through controlled stimuli. This darker take drew parallels to real-world research into computational psychology. Caleb's involvement was also once less random. In unused drafts, he was selected precisely because his emotional vulnerabilities made him an ideal subject for an experiment measuring human susceptibility to generated empathy cues. Rather than evaluating Ava, he was being studied as part of a broader trial on hybrid emotional influence, an idea later softened to maintain narrative clarity. Ava's escape was originally framed not as a triumphant act of independence, but as the culmination of a long-term behavioral sequence engineered by Nathan to observe whether an AIIU could orchestrate its own liberation. The implication was that she and Caleb were part of a closed-loop experiment. The final film maintains its cerebral tension, but the hidden version reveals something far more haunting, a story where the question wasn't whether an AI could feel, but how far humans were willing to push consciousness in the name of research. 4. The Island 2005. The Island already deals with cloning and organ harvesting, but early drafts and pre-production notes reveal a far more sinister intent. The facility wasn't meant to be a simple repository of clones waiting for transplants. It was envisioned as a fully operational experimental complex conducting long-term behavioral conditioning studies on its subjects. Originally, the clones underwent daily cognitive tests disguised as routine activities. Early scripts described classes, exercises, and social interactions as carefully choreographed experiments to evaluate how quickly artificially grown humans could develop independent thought. Researchers monitored subjects for anomalies, with some clones quietly removed after showing signs of emotional depth beyond acceptable thresholds. These ideas were toned down to avoid making the film too psychologically oppressive. One removed sequence revealed that the lottery was not just a mechanism for harvesting organs, but a behavioral compliance tool. Drafts showed how scientists tracked stress responses, fear spikes, and obedience levels during lottery announcements. The emotional data collected was used to refine conditioning methods for future batches of clones. Studio executives removed these scenes for being too clinical and uncomfortably reminiscent of documented behavior modification studies. Lincoln 6 Echo's awakening was also once more explicit. Rather than discovering the truth by accident, he was meant to be the result of a failed conditioning cycle, a clone whose critical thinking developed faster than anticipated, forcing the facility to reconsider its protocols. This angle was softened to keep the film more action-driven. Even the sterile white aesthetic originally had a darker foundation. Early concept art depicted rooms with biometric lighting that shifted color based on subjects' cognitive states, allowing researchers to diagnose psychological changes visually. These ideas were abandoned for budget and tonal reasons. While the final film remains a slick action thriller, its original incarnation was an unnerving depiction of a clone population raised not just to be harvested, but to be studied, controlled, and calibrated like psychological instruments. 5. Blade Runner 1982. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner already presents a bleak vision of artificial life, but the earlier drafts imagined an even more disturbing foundation: replicants, as disposable products of systemic experimentation. The theatrical cut hints at this, yet the original scripts delved deeply into the mechanics of manufacturing obedience trauma and artificial memory concepts, later reduced to maintain the film's poetic ambiguity. Early versions of the story described Tyrell Corporation running ongoing trials that tested the emotional stability of replicants by placing them in increasingly volatile scenarios. Some drafts detailed stress gauntlets designed to evaluate how quickly a replicant's implanted memories could be destabilized to measure psychological resilience. These sequences portrayed replicants undergoing forced empathy drills, cognitive confusion tests, and combat conditioning, all overseen by executives, treating them like biological prototypes. The Voight-Kampff test was also once framed differently. Originally, it wasn't merely a detection tool, but part of a larger experimental program measuring how replicants responded to emotional stimuli designed to trigger trauma-linked memories. Early notes suggested that certain questions were intentionally crafted to destabilize replicants, mentally revealing whether their implanted childhoods could withstand psychological pressure. Deckard's character also carried a heavier thematic weight. In unused drafts, he suffered from memory gaps that implied he had been repeatedly subjected to mental patching, suggesting he was once part of a test group before becoming a Blade Runner. This version was considered too bleak and risked removing the ambiguity that fueled the film's mystique. Even the replicant uprising subplot was once more explicit. Rather than simple rebels, the Nexus models were described as failed experimental units who developed emotional depth as a side effect of neural overstimulation. Their rebellion wasn't just a demand for freedom, it was an unplanned emergence caused by flawed experimentation. The final film preserved the haunting atmosphere but stripped away much of its darker underpinnings. Yet the hidden version reveals a world where synthetic beings weren't created to serve, they were created to suffer.
6. Minority Report 2002.
Before Minority Report became a sleek, high-tech thriller about futuristic policing, its earliest drafts carried a far more unsettling implication. The pre-crime system was not merely a justice tool, but the centerpiece of a government-sanctioned human experimentation program. Spielberg ultimately softened these ideas, but internal memos and early concept materials reveal a version of the film that bordered on psychological horror. The three precogs, Agatha, Arthur, and Dashiell, were originally portrayed not as tragic victims gifted with premonition, but as subjects of a neurological trial examining the effects of sensory deprivation and forced psychic stimulation. Early drafts described how their minds were overloaded with continuous streams of violent stimuli, creating a feedback loop of trauma that allowed them to predict patterns of behavior. Storyboards depicted labs filled with neuromapping devices, implying the precogs were constantly monitored to extract predictive algorithms from their neural signatures. Another removed concept centered on precog drift, a condition in which the constant processing of future crimes caused the subjects to hallucinate alternate versions of reality. The film initially explored how their visions were intentionally manipulated by the agency, not to prevent crime, but to test the accuracy of experimental cognitive models. These implications were cut to avoid comparisons with debates surrounding predictive policing and behavioral surveillance emerging in the early 2000s. Even Anderton's arc originally painted him as part of a long-term behavioral study. Several drafts showed that pre-crime monitored not just his actions, but his emotional vulnerabilities, testing whether personal instability could be engineered to guide subjects into predetermined scenarios. This angle was removed for being too invasive and potentially controversial. By the time Minority Report reached theaters, audiences saw a visionary sci-fi thriller. But beneath its polished exterior lies a far darker narrative, one where the future wasn't predicted through superhuman ability, but extracted from unwilling subjects trapped in a perpetual nightmare of weaponized psychology. 7. The Abyss 1989. James Cameron's The Abyss is remembered for its groundbreaking underwater visuals and awe-inspiring alien encounter. Yet buried beneath its optimistic final tone lies a forgotten version steeped in psychological manipulation and covert experimentation. Early drafts portrayed the deep-sea environment not as a frontier of discovery, but as an ideal setting for classified psychological research, echoing real-world studies into extreme isolation and sensory disruption. Originally, the crew of Deep Core was not chosen simply for their expertise. Early notes suggest they were selected because their psychological profiles made them suitable subjects for stress-induced behavioral observation. One removed scene showed Navy officials discussing the mission as an opportunity to test containment responses in high-pressure environments. These ideas were eventually scrapped for fear they would make the military appear complicit in unethical trials. The film's most intense sequences, particularly those involving the character Bud, were once directly tied to experimental conditions. Drafts described fluctuating oxygen levels not as accidents, but as deliberate stress tests embedded in the mission protocol. Unused dialogue hinted that Bud's emotional extremes were monitored remotely by military psychologists analyzing the limits of human resilience. Even the famous liquid breathing sequence had a darker angle. In early versions, the technology was part of an unapproved experiment intended to study how humans adapt to invasive respiratory systems. Scenes showed test subjects experiencing panic neurological overload and dissociative episodes. Cameron later softened these implications to maintain the film's more hopeful tone. Perhaps the most unsettling cut concept involved the themselves. Some drafts portrayed them observing the crew as one might study lab specimens, analyzing their reactions to conflict, fear, and cooperation. The peaceful ending was not always guaranteed. Certain versions suggested the aliens were evaluating whether humans were stable enough for contact or too volatile to be allowed to surface. While the abyss emerged as a message of unity, its hidden version paints a far more haunting picture, a story where the deepest trench on Earth served as the perfect laboratory for psychological experimentation carried out far from the eyes of the world. 8. Alien Resurrection 1997. Though often remembered for its bioorganic visuals and hybrid monstrosities, Alien Resurrection originally embraced an even more disturbing theme: the systematic experimentation on cloned humans. Early drafts and production notes reveal that the film setting the USM Auriga was intended not as a simple military science vessel, but as a full-scale Black Ops laboratory dedicated to unauthorized cloning research. The earliest script drafts depicted entire wings of the ship filled with failed clone experiments. These versions were not limited to the grotesque eighth clone shown in the final film. Instead, they included dozens of malformed iterations of Ripley, each representing a different experiment in memory retention, trauma transfer, and genetic reinforcement. Storyboards illustrated researchers studying how much of Ripley's original consciousness could be extracted from cloned tissue, a chilling parallel to speculative theories about memory encoding in DNA. A removed subplot focused on the Auriga's scientists running behavioral trials on cloned subjects, forcing them to respond to environmental stressors while monitoring neural activity. Some clones developed partial memories, others displayed aggression, and some were incapable of emotional regulation, details too disturbing for the theatrical release. Even the hybrid xenomorph was once framed more as a deliberate genetic project than an accidental mutation. Draft notes implied the military sought to combine xenomorph adaptability with human neuroplasticity to create a controllable weapon. These implications were later softened to keep the film from appearing as commentary on unethical genetic research. Ripley 8's emotional turmoil was also significantly toned down. Early scenes depicted her experiencing intrusive memory fragments from previous clones, echoes of mutilated ancestors, as one document phrased it. The studio removed these elements due to concerns they were psychologically overwhelming and risked alienating audiences. The final film still carries traces of these ideas, but the hidden version is much more sinister, a story not about monsters born from aliens, but about monsters created through relentless experimentation on human identity itself. 9. RoboCop 1987. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop is famous for its satirical brutality, but beneath the version audiences saw lies a far more unsettling exploration of corporate experimentation on the human mind. Early drafts portrayed the transformation of Alex Murphy not as a tragic resurrection, but as an intentional cognitive trial conducted by Omni Consumer Products. Instead of reviving Murphy to create a hero, OCP's original plan involved testing how much of a human consciousness could be overwritten, suppressed, or redirected to serve corporate interests. Unused scenes describe neurological procedures where Murphy's memories were repeatedly wiped and reloaded in controlled cycles, each test measuring emotional resistance and identity retention. In one discarded sequence, technicians debated whether Murphy's lingering memories were a data ghost, the residual imprint of a previous personality, which they attempted to erase using targeted electrical pulses. Studio execs feared the scene resembled reports of controversial behavioral experiments involving identity fragmentation, leading to its removal. Another discarded concept framed OCP's cyborg program as part of a larger initiative to test obedience architecture. Early concept art depicted prototype cyborgs with more invasive interfaces, wires directly threading through brain tissue biofeedback chambers for rapid conditioning and experimental neurosuppression devices attached to the spine. These designs were considered too grotesque and too reminiscent of unethical trials from real discussions of cybernetic research. Even Murphy's emotional collapse was once more explicit. In an early script, he experienced moments of cognitive dissonance where pre-recorded directive messages played inside his head like intrusive thoughts, suggesting that OCP was not just controlling his body, but actively editing his mind. This psychological horror angle was dialed down to avoid pushing the film into darker territory beyond mainstream tolerance. While RoboCop remains a sharp commentary on dehumanization, the hidden version suggests something much more disturbing: the creation of a human-machine hybrid wasn't a technological miracle, but a cold, deliberate experiment in consciousness suppression. Murphy wasn't just rebuilt, he was rewritten. 10. Sunshine, 2007. Danny Boyle's Sunshine is already unsettling, but the version audiences saw is significantly lighter than what the filmmakers first designed. Early drafts framed the Icarus missions not simply as attempts to reignite the sun, but as experimental case studies on isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological collapse, concepts inspired by extreme environment research from aerospace programs. One abandoned storyline detailed that Icarus I was never lost. Instead, its crew succumbed to a classified psychological conditioning experiment embedded within the mission protocol. A hidden module, known in drafts as the Solace Procedure, exposed crew members to increasing waves of solar-filtered radiation designed to evaluate the limits of human perception. The resulting hallucinations were not supernatural, but neurological responses to overstimulation. These sequences were removed early because they resembled controversial military experiments involving sensory modulation. Captain Pinbacker originally was not a deranged survivor, but a failed test subject whose consciousness had fragmented due to prolonged exposure. Deleted lines implied he had been intentionally subjected to enhanced solar proximity to study the breakdown of identity. Boyle removed these implications after concerns arose about mirroring real-world discussions about classified psychological trials. Kappa's character was also once more deeply tied to experimentation. Draft notes show he was meant to discover encrypted research logs aboard Icarus, revealing that the mission was as much about observing the human mind under cosmic pressure as it was about saving Earth. These logs described physiological changes in the crew, altered circadian rhythms, dream interference, and disassociation documented like lab reports. The studio encouraged Boyle to soften these ideas to maintain a broader appeal and avoid framing the film as human experimentation disguised as a space mission. While Sunshine remains a beautifully crafted descent into cosmic tension, its hidden version is far more sinister, a story suggesting humanity's final hope was built on the willingness to sacrifice conscious minds for data collected in the dark. 11. The Matrix 1999. The Matrix was already groundbreaking, but early versions of the script reveal a version much darker one that leaned into the psychological terror of human experimentation on a global scale. Before the studio pushed for a more streamlined, action-oriented narrative, the Wachowskis designed The Matrix not simply as a simulation, but as a perpetual cognitive labyrinth program created to run behavioral trials on humanity. Original treatments described multiple experimental matrix layers, each designed to test different psychological stress thresholds. Rather than a singular simulation, early drafts suggested the machines were conducting long-term studies on human decision-making, resilience, and obedience. Neo's awakening wasn't meant to be the discovery of the one, but the latest in a chain of failed test subjects whose responses were logged, analyzed, and recycled. This version was considered too oppressive and too nihilistic for mainstream audiences. Unused storyboards show a sequence where Neo glimpses archived simulations, entire eras of human history, artificially recreated to observe how societies collapse or stabilize under engineered conditions. This concept drew uncomfortable parallels with real-world research into mass behavior modeling and predictive policing algorithms. Warner Bros. Requested that the theme be scaled back to avoid accusations of mirroring controversial technological debates of the late 90s. Morpheus was also originally portrayed as a former subject who had undergone experimental memory fracturing, making him unable to distinguish between prior simulation cycles. One removed monologue revealed that he had been woken up multiple times, with each escape attempt shaping his personality differently, an idea studio executives found too confusing and too disturbing. Even the iconic human farms were toned down. Early descriptions framed the pods not as energy sources, but as neural data extraction units. The machines weren't harvesting electricity, they were harvesting cognition. Although the final film remains revolutionary, the hidden version of The Matrix was a far more chilling interrogation of human autonomy, a world where every mind served as raw material for a continuous scientific experiment, too vast for any individual to comprehend. 12. Gattaca 1997. Most viewers remember Gattaca as a sleek, elegant critique of genetic discrimination, but its earliest drafts were far harsher, bordering on psychological horror. Andrew Niccol originally constructed the film as a near-future dossier exploring covert eugenics programs modeled after speculative genetic ranking systems discussed quietly among certain scientific and governmental circles during the 1980s and early 90s. Much of this material was softened or completely excised for the final release. The darkest concept removed involved the genetic ascension trials, a series of state-sanctioned experiments intended to determine whether superior DNA could override environmental trauma. Early drafts described facilities where children were raised under tightly controlled conditions, their behavior logged and modified through conditioning techniques. These sequences portrayed gene-engineered subjects undergoing mandatory neurological assessments, hinting at a culture where experimentation was not merely accepted, but expected. Studio memos show concern that these scenes felt too aligned with real historical programs, prompting their removal. Vincent's storyline was also once more extreme. In initial versions, his fraudulent identity did not merely risk discovery, it exposed him to potential genetic reclamation procedures. This removed concept suggested that invalids posing as valids could be forcibly studied, their bodies used to calibrate deviation metrics for a new generation of genetic scanners. While never filmed, these ideas remain preserved in early notes and were deemed too ethically volatile for the final cut. Even Irene's character originally carried remnants of a failed enhancement program suffering from genetic side effects that the public believed had been eliminated decades earlier. Drafts explored how she feared becoming a case study rather than a citizen, a theme significantly dialed back to preserve the film's romantic undertone. By the time Gattaca reached theaters, audiences received a refined, thoughtful drama. But its hidden foundation was far bleaker, an unsettling examination of a society where experimentation didn't happen in secret, but was woven into everyday life just out of frame. What remains in the final version is the silhouette of a far more chilling world Hollywood wasn't ready to show. 13. The Fly 1986. David Cronenberg's The Fly is already regarded as one of the most disturbing explorations of body horror ever put to film, but the version audiences received was significantly toned down from the original intent. Early drafts leaned even more heavily into the scientific experimentation aspect, drawing inspiration from speculative biotechnology papers discussing metabolic fusion tissue, overgrowth, and uncontrolled gene expression. These documents, though unofficial and never publicly acknowledged by researchers, were cited by the film's early concept artists during pre-production. In the initial script, Seth Brundle did not merely merge with the Fly. His transformation was meant to unfold like a deliberate biological trial gone wrong, paralleling gene manipulation experiments whispered about within certain academic circles. Drafted scenes explored the idea of the telepods performing microscopic disassembly and reconstruction, hinting that the machine functioned as an unsupervised genetic editor. Several sequences depicted the telepods analyzing Brundle's DNA while applying unknown corrective algorithms, suggesting the machine was experimenting on him rather than malfunctioning blindly. One famously deleted scene featured Brundle attempting to merge himself with a baboon and a cat simultaneously. Although the sequence was shot, it was removed because it felt too much like vivisection, according to studio notes, and risked framing the film as commentary on real-world genetic research. Another abandoned plotline showed Brundle documenting his transformation in a private archive labeled Iteration Log, implying he viewed himself as both subject and scientist of his own deteriorating body. Cronenberg toned down these implications to avoid the film being interpreted as an attack on emerging genetic technologies. Producers also feared drawing attention to ongoing debates about bioethics in the 1980s, which might have overshadowed the film. The theatrical version thus leans emotional and tragic rather than procedural and experimental. Yet the hidden version of The Fly reveals a far more chilling premise that Brundle's mutation wasn't just an accident, it was the unintended consequence of a machine performing experiments beyond human understanding, using him as its most convenient test subject. 14A. Artificial Intelligence 2001. Before I became the reflective, emotional journey audiences recognize today, early drafts by Stanley Kubrick and initial development notes suggested a version far more clinical and far more unsettling. This darker incarnation of the film centered heavily on experimental child psychology, synthetic empathy, and the ethics of engineered consciousness. Instead of a fairy tale odyssey, the initial concept explored the consequences of building an artificial child capable of imprinting an idea, inspired in part by controversial cognitive behavioral trials from the mid-20th century. One abandoned sequence depicted a facility where multiple prototypes like David were tested simultaneously. Instead of a single unique child, the drafts described entire rooms of identical units undergoing emotional conditioning, each responding differently to affection, neglect, and controlled stress environments. Production notes admit these scenes were removed because they echoed real psychological experiments too closely. Studio executives feared the parallels would spark backlash, especially given the film's theme of manufactured love. Original storyboards also included a sequence where David's neural matrix destabilized under conflicting emotional inputs, revealing how the company monitored his pain and attachment levels like laboratory metrics. The studio considered it too disturbing to portray a childlike being in genuine psychological distress, even if synthetic. Perhaps the most suppressed idea came from Kubrick's earliest treatment and implication that children were unofficially deployed into test households without the family's informed consent, mirroring unconfirmed claims about early behavioral research. Spielberg softened or removed these elements, entirely transforming the story into something more accessible and less provocative. Even the ending originally leaned darker. Rather than an almost hopeful resurrection, David was meant to confront the truth that he had been one of many prototypes abandoned after the project was shut down. Archival drafts confirmed that the tone was intended to evoke isolation and scientific disposability, not closure. While I remains a landmark sci-fi drama, its hidden version was a haunting introspection on experimentation, emotional manipulation, and the ethics of manufacturing affection concepts Hollywood decided should stay beneath the surface. 15 Event Horizon 1997. When Event Horizon was released, audiences already sensed something unusually grim beneath its surface. But what most viewers don't know is that the theatrical cut represents only a fraction of how dark the film was originally intended to be. Early drafts and rough-cut footage, some of which was screened only once for executives before being shelved, revealed an even more disturbing portrait of scientific ambition slipping into cosmic madness. The original concept focused heavily on experimental gravitational research, modeled after unverified military attempts to bend space using unstable energy fields. In the film's earliest script, the Event Horizon's gravity drive was not simply a plot device, but a representation of theoretical propulsion experiments rumored to have been proposed in actual aerospace documents of the late 1980s. These versions showed test subjects exposed to magnetic distortions, sensory fragmentation, and severe neurological effects imagery that paralleled unofficial accounts of classified research into extreme environment cognition. Early cuts extended the infamous hell footage far beyond what audiences saw. These sequences showed crew members undergoing biomechanical corruption as the ship used their bodies as conduits for multidimensional feedback, implying a form of involuntary experimentation.
Several scenes depicted the ship harvesting neurological signatures from the crew to stabilize its portal, hinting that the vessel's technology required living subjects to function.
Studio notes labeled these moments as too graphic, too real, too suggestive of human experimentation. Much of this was removed to avoid earning an unreleasable rating and to distance the film from interpretations linking its science to real-world research. Even the ship itself originally had a more explicit arc. It wasn't merely alive, but was functioning as a containment mechanism for failed experiments conducted during the ship's initial voyage, a storyline ultimately stripped from the final script. Though the surviving cut remains disturbing, the hidden version of Event Horizon was a chilling fusion of physics, psychology, and experimentation so extreme that Hollywood decided audiences weren't ready for it. What remains is only the shadow of the film its creators first imagined. And US Pandorum 2009. On the surface, Pandorum appears to be a claustrophobic descent into deep space paranoia, but the earliest drafts reveal a far more disturbing foundation. The Elysium was not only a vessel for colonization, it was the site of a covert behavioral evolution experiment orchestrated long before the crew ever left Earth. Early script notes described the hypersleep program as an experimental system designed to accelerate human adaptability through prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. Instead of simply preserving the crew, the sleep cycles were intended to fragment identity, suppress long-term memory, and induce neurochemical shifts that could force evolutionary jumps under extreme conditions. According to these drafts, the psychological degradation known as pandorum wasn't a malfunction. It was a predictable outcome of an intentionally unstable protocol meant to observe how the human mind reorganizes itself when stripped off familiarity. Even more unsettling was the original portrayal of the mutated creatures. Rather than spontaneous products of environmental contamination, early treatments framed them as the result of a clandestine enhancement serum administered to colonists before launch. This serum, based loosely on speculative research into forced adaptation, was designed to accelerate physiological evolution in response to new environments. The ship's malfunction didn't create the monsters, it merely revealed what humanity might become when guided by experimentation instead of natural process. Bauer's journey was also once framed more explicitly as part of the study. Early drafts hinted that his awakening was scheduled based on his psychological profile, marking him as an ideal subject for observing survival instincts under extreme disorientation. In these versions, his interactions with other survivors were monitored through a dormant oversight system still running in the background of the ship. The theatrical cut softened these implications, leaning into horror rather than the chilling idea that the Elysium was a floating laboratory. The hidden version suggests a much darker truth: the mission to save humanity may have always been a covert attempt to reshape it. The films we explored tonight remind us that what reaches the screen is often only the surface of a much deeper design. Drafts buried in studio archives, scenes erased before the public could see them, and concepts softened to avoid uncomfortable questions, all hint at a version of science fiction far darker than what audiences were allowed to witness. These hidden experiments reveal how close art sometimes drifts to reality and how quickly those parallels are concealed. If you're ready to open another vault, tell us which film you want unlocked next. Some stories were never meant to be found, but here we open them anyway.